The Other Lodgers by Ambrose Bierce. In order to take that train, said Colonel Levering, sitting in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, you will have to remain nearly all night in Atlanta. That is a fine city, but I advise you not to put up at the Breathitt House, one of the principal hotels. It is an old wooden building in urgent need of repairs. There are breaches in the walls that you could throw a cat through. The bedrooms have no locks on the doors, no furniture but a single chair in each, and a bedstead without bedding, just a mattress. Even these meager accommodations you cannot be sure that you will have in Monopoly. You must take your chance of being stowed in with a lot of others. Sir, it is a most abominable hotel. The night that I passed in it was an uncomfortable night. I got in late and was shown to my room on the ground floor by an apologetic night clerk with a tallow candle, which he considerately left with me. I was worn out by 2 days and a night of hard railway travel, and had not entirely recovered from a gunshot wound in the head received in an altercation. Rather than look for better quarters, I lay down on the mattress without removing my clothing and fell asleep. Along toward morning, I awoke. The moon had risen and was shining in at the uncurtained window, illuminating the room with a soft bluish light, which seemed somehow a bit spooky, although I dare say it had no uncommon quality. All moonlight is that way if you will observe it. Imagine my surprise and indignation when I saw the floor occupied by at least a dozen other lodgers. I sat up, earnestly damning the management of that unthinkable hotel, and was about to spring from the bed to go and make trouble for the night clerk, him of the apologetic manner and the tallow candle, when something in the situation affected me with a strange indisposition to move. I suppose I was what a story writer might call frozen with terror. For those men were obviously all dead. They lay on their backs, disposed orderly along 3 sides of the room, their feet to the walls. Against the other wall, farthest from the door, stood my bed and the chair. All the faces were covered, but under the white cloth, the features of the 2 bodies that lay in the square patch of moonlight near the window showed in sharp profile as to nose and chin. I thought this a bad dream, and tried to cry out, as one does in a nightmare, but could make no sound. At last, with a desperate effort, I threw my feet to the floor, and passing between the 2 rows of clouded faces and the 2 bodies that lay nearest the door, I escaped from the infernal place and ran to the office. The night clerk was there, behind the desk, sitting in the dim light of another tallow candle, just sitting and staring. He did not rise. My abrupt entrance produced no effect upon him, though I must have looked a veritable corpse myself. It occurred to me then that I had not before really observed the fellow. He was a little chap with a colorless face and the whitest, blankest eyes I ever saw. He had no more expression than the back of my hand. His clothing was a dirty gray. "Damn you," I said. "What do you mean?" Just the same, I was shaking like a leaf in the wind and did not recognize my own voice. The night clerk rose, bowed apologetically, and, well, he was no longer there. And at that moment, I felt a hand laid upon my shoulder from behind. Just fancy that if you can. Unspeakably frightened, I turned and saw a portly, kind-faced gentleman who asked, "What is the matter, my friend?" I was not long in telling him, but before I made an end of it, he went pale himself. "See here," he said, "are you telling the truth?" I had now got myself in hand, and terror had given place to indignation. "If you dare to doubt it," I said, "I'll hammer the life out of you." "No," he replied, "no, don't do that. Just sit down till I tell you. This is not a hotel. It used to be. Afterward, it was a hospital. Now it is unoccupied, awaiting a tenant. The room that you mentioned was the dead room. There were always plenty of dead. The fellow that you call the night clerk used to be that, but later he booked the patients as they were brought in. I don't understand his being here. He has been dead a few weeks." "And who are you?" I blurted out. "Oh, I look after the premises. I happened to be passing just now, and seeing a light in here, came in to investigate. Let us have a look into that room," he added, lifting the sputtering candle from the desk. "I'll see you at the devil first," said I, bolting out the door into the street. "Sir, that breathed house in Atlanta is a beastly place. Don't you stop there." "God forbid. Your account of it certainly does not suggest comfort. By the way, Colonel, when did all that occur?" "In September 1864, shortly after the siege of Atlanta, during the war between the states." The moral of the story? Sharing a room with the dead might be a little creepy, but at least they don't snore. A Fruitless Assignment by Ambrose Bierce. Henry Saylor, who was killed in Covington in a quarrel with Antonio Finch, was a reporter on the Cincinnati Commercial. In the year 1859, a vacant dwelling in Vine Street in Cincinnati became the center of a local excitement because of the strange sights and sounds said to be observed in it nightly. According to the testimony of many reputable residents of the vicinity, these were inconsistent with any other hypothesis than that the house was haunted. Figures with something singularly unfamiliar about them were seen by crowds on the sidewalk to pass in and out. No one could say just where they appeared upon the open lawn on their way to the front door by which they entered, nor at exactly which point they vanished as they came out. Or rather, while each spectator was positive enough about these matters, no two agreed. They were all similarly at variance in their descriptions of the figures themselves. Several of the bolder of the curious throng ventured on several evenings to stand upon the doorstep to intercept them, or, failing in this, get a nearer look at them. These courageous men, it was said, were unable to force the door by their united strength, and always were hurled from the steps by some invisible agency and severely injured, the door immediately afterwards opening, apparently of its own volition, to admit or free some ghostly guest. The dwelling was known as the Roscoe House, a family of that name having lived there for several years, and then, one by one, they disappeared, the last to leave being an old woman. Stories of foul play and successive murders had always been rife, but never were authenticated. One day, during the prevalence of the excitement, Saylor presented himself at the office of the Commercial for orders. He received a note from the city editor, which read as follows: "Go and pass the night alone in the haunted house in Vine Street, and if anything occurs worthwhile, make 2 columns." Saylor obeyed his superior. He could not afford to lose his position on the paper. Apprising the police of his intention, He effected an entrance through a rear window before dark, walked through the deserted rooms, bare of furniture, dusty and desolate, and seating himself at last in the parlor on an old sofa, which he had dragged in from another room, watched the deepening of the gloom as night came on. Before it was altogether dark, the curious crowd had collected in the street, silent as a rule, and expectant, with, here and there, a scoffer uttering his incredulity and courage with scornful remarks or ribald cries. None knew of the anxious watcher inside. He feared to make a light. The uncurtained windows would have betrayed his presence, subjecting him to insult, possibly to injury. Moreover, he was too conscientious to do anything to enfeeble his impressions, and unwilling to alter any of the customary conditions under which the manifestations were said to occur. It was now dark outside, but light from the street faintly illuminated the part of the room that he was in. He had set open every door in the whole interior, above and below, but all the outer ones were locked and bolted. Sudden exclamations from the crowd caused him to spring to the window and look out. He saw the figure of a man moving rapidly across the lawn towards the building, saw it ascend the steps, then a projection of the wall concealed it. There was a noise as of the opening and closing of the hall door. He heard quick, heavy footsteps along the passage, heard them ascend the stairs, heard them on the uncarpeted floor of the chamber immediately overhead. Sailor promptly drew his pistol, and groping his way up the stairs, entered the chamber, dimly lighted from the street. No one was there. He heard footsteps in an adjoining room, and entered that. It was dark and silent. He struck his foot against some object on the floor, knelt by it, passed his hand over it. It was a human head, that of a woman. Lifting it by the hair, this iron-nerved man returned to the half-lighted room below, carried it near the window, and attentively examined it. While so engaged, he was half conscious of the rapid opening and closing of the outer door, of footfalls sounding all about him. He raised his eyes from the ghastly object of his attention and saw himself the center of a crowd of men and women, dimly seen. The room was thronged with them. He thought the people had broken in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said coolly, "you see me under suspicious circumstances." But his voice was drowned in peals of laughter, such laughter as is heard in asylums for the insane. The persons about him pointed to the object in his hand, and their merriment increased as he dropped it, and it went rolling among their feet. They danced about it with gestures grotesque and attitudes obscene and indescribable. They struck it with their feet, urging it about the room from wall to wall, pushed and overthrew one another in their struggles to kick it, cursed and screamed and sang snatches of ribald songs as a battered head battered about the room as if in terror and trying to escape. At last it shot out of the door into the hall, followed by all with tumultuous haste. That moment the door closed with a sharp concussion. Sailor was alone, in dead silence. Carefully putting away his pistol, which all the time he had held in his hand, he went to a window and looked out. The street was deserted and silent. The lamps were extinguished. The roofs and chimneys of the houses were sharply outlined against the dawn light in the east. He left the house, the door yielding easily to his hand, and walked to the commercial office. The city editor was still in his office, asleep. Sailor waked him and said, "I have been at the haunted house." The editor stared blankly, as if not wholly awake. "Good God!" he cried. "Are you sailor?" "Yes. Why not?" The editor made no answer, but continued staring. "I passed the night there, it seems," said Sailor. "They say that things were uncommonly quiet out there," the editor said, trifling with a paperweight upon which he had dropped his eyes. "Did anything occur?" "Nothing. Nothing whatever." The moral of the story? Some young reporters will literally do anything to get ahead. It was Christmas Eve, 1889, in South Bend, Indiana. The Larch family were entertaining guests, including a circuit court judge and his wife, plus a lawyer from Chicago. Dinner over, they had all gathered around the organ to sing Christmas carols, while Mrs. Larch, the local church organist, played for them. 11-year-old Oliver was making popcorn on the stove when his father noticed the bucket of drinking water was almost empty and asked Oliver to go to the well and draw some more. Oliver put on his overcoat and galoshes. It was 1889 after all, and grabbed the bucket and headed out through the back door. No doubt he was thirsty from all the popcorn. Oliver was only gone about 10 seconds when the adults around the organ heard his terrified screams. Mr. Larch grabbed a lantern as the adults all hurried outside. There was 5 or 6 inches of snow on the ground, so they could easily follow Oliver's footprints, which were clearly visible for some 75 feet, halfway to the well, where they stopped. Dead. There were no other footprints, no signs of a struggle, no nothing. The metal bucket was found 15 feet from the line of footsteps, as if it had been dropped from above. Later, the metal handle was found to be fused, as if exposed to extreme heat. The searchers could hear cries, "Help, Mother! Help, Father! Help me! Help me! They've got me! They've got me!" But the cries seemed to be coming from the darkness overhead, as if Oliver had been levitated into the night sky. And Oliver Larch was never seen again, but for weeks after, his cries for help were heard coming from above, from the sky. This was a piss-cutter story I read in C.B. Colby's The Weirdest People in the World back in 1965, and I never forgot it. But the saga of Oliver Larch has an equally interesting backstory. The Larch story had previously appeared back in 1956 in Strangest of All by Frank Edwards, a writer who specialized in accounts of paranormal events. When I was in grade 7, a buddy of mine loaned me a hardcover copy of Edwards' first book, Stranger Than Science, and I stayed up half the night reading it. Apparently, the story of Oliver Larch also appeared in The Case for the UFO by Morris K. Jessup, another book I read back in the day. But the story didn't originate with Morris K. Jessup or Frank Edwards. In the September 1950 edition of Fate magazine, a magazine devoted to accounts of the paranormal, writer Joseph Rosenberger penned a very similar story of a mysterious disappearance, but this time the victim was a 20-year-old Oliver Larch, who vanished from South Bend, Indiana on Christmas Eve 1890. 6 years later, Frank Edwards' account changed Oliver from a lurch to a larch, his age from 20 to 11, and the year from 1890 to 1889. According to author Kevin Randall, Morris K. Jessup claimed, in The Case for the UFO, that the South Bend, Indiana Police Department had files relating to the disappearance of Oliver Larch/Lurch. So Randall phoned the police department only to learn that their records only went back to 1920. But a call to the local newspaper, the South Bend Tribune, was more successful and yielded a number of clippings from the 50s and 60s, including one featuring an interview with members of the Larch family who still lived in the area. They said the story simply wasn't true. Even worse, it appears the weather for Christmas Eve in both 1889 and 90 featured temperatures in the 50s and 60s Fahrenheit, so forget about 6 inches of snow on the ground. And hey, I could use those temperatures around here in Canada at Christmas time. So where did this story come from? Rosenberger claimed to have made the whole thing up, but further research by authors Theo Pagmans and Chris Aubeck in the Fortean Times revealed that the story had been kicking around for years, and they ultimately connected it to another man who disappeared, Ambrose Bierce. For those of you unfamiliar with the name, Ambrose Bierce was an American writer of Civil War stories. He was a Union Army veteran and of weird fiction. His most famous story is An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Owl Creek Bridge. If you've never read him, I encourage you to do so. Bierce's nickname was Bitter Bierce, and to say he was cynical and cantankerous is an understatement. After all, among his publications was The Devil's Dictionary. Bierce himself disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1914, when, at the age of 72, he went to Mexico to interview Pancho Villa and was never heard from again. Who knows? Perhaps he's wandering out there still. In 1888, Bierce wrote an article called Whither? Some Strange Instances of Mysterious Disappearance, which was published in the October 14th edition of the San Francisco Examiner, and later in his 1893 collection, Can Such Things Be? The article featured accounts of 3 supposedly true disappearances. The one that concerns us is Charles Ashmore's Trail. It reads, The family of Christian Ashmore consisted of his wife, his mother, 2 grown daughters, and a son of 16 years. They lived in Troy, New York, were well-to-do, respectable persons, and had many friends, some of whom, reading these lines, will doubtless learn for the first time the extraordinary fate of the young man. From Troy, the Ashmores moved in 1871 or 1872 to Richmond, Indiana, and a year or 2 later to the vicinity of Quincy, Illinois, where Mr. Ashmore bought a farm and lived on it. At some little distance from the farmhouse was a spring with a constant flow of clear, cold water, whence the family derived its supply for domestic use at all seasons. On the evening of the 9th of November in 1878, at about 9 o'clock, young Charles Ashmore left the family circle around the hearth took a tin bucket, and started towards the spring. As he did not return, the family became uneasy, and going to the door by which he had left the house, his father called without receiving an answer. He then lighted a lantern, and with the eldest daughter Martha, who insisted on accompanying him, went in search. A light snow had fallen, obliterating the path, but making the young man's trail conspicuous. Each footprint was plainly defined. After going a little more than halfway, perhaps 75 yards, the father, who was in advance, halted, and elevating his lantern, stood peering intently into the darkness ahead. "What is the matter, father?" the girl asked. This was the matter. The trail of the young man had abruptly ended, and all beyond was smooth, unbroken snow. The last footprints were as conspicuous as any in the line. The very nail marks were distinctly visible. Mr. Ashmore looked upward, shading his eyes with his hat, held between them and the lantern. The stars were shining. There was not a cloud in the sky. He was denied the explanation which had suggested itself, doubtful as it would have been. A new snowfall with a limit so plainly defined. Taking a wide circuit round the ultimate tracks so as to leave them undisturbed for further examination, the man proceeded to the spring, the girl following, weak and terrified. Neither had spoken a word of what both had observed. The spring was covered with ice, hours old. Returning to the house, they noted the appearance of the snow on both sides of the trail its entire length. No tracks led away from it. The morning light showed nothing more. Smooth, spotless, unbroken, the shallow snow lay everywhere. 4 days later, the grief-stricken mother herself went to the spring for water. She came back and related that in passing the spot where the footprints had ended, she had heard the voice of her son and had been eagerly calling to him, wandering about the place, as she had fancied the voice to be now in one direction, now in another, until she was exhausted with fatigue and emotion. Questioned as to what the voice had said, she was unable to tell, yet averred that the words were perfectly distinct. In a moment, the entire family was at the place, but nothing was heard, and the voice was believed to be a hallucination caused by the mother's great anxiety and her disordered nerves. But for months afterward, at irregular intervals of a few days, the voice was heard by the several members of the family and by others. All declared it unmistakably the voice of Charles Ashmore. All agreed that it seemed to come from a great distance, faintly, yet with entire distinctness of articulation. Yet none could determine its direction, nor repeat its words. The intervals of silence grew longer and longer. The voice fainter and farther, and by midsummer it was heard no more. If anybody knows the fate of Charles Ashmore, it is probably his mother. She is dead. Mysterious Disappearances by Ambrose Bierce, originally published in the San Francisco Examiner on October 14th, 1888. 1. The difficulty of crossing a field. One morning in July 1854, a planter named Williamson, living 6 miles from Selma, Alabama, was sitting with his wife and a child on the veranda of his dwelling. Immediately in front of the house was a lawn, perhaps 50 yards in extent, between the house and public road, or, as it was called, the pike. Beyond this road lay a close-cropped pasture of some 10 acres, level and without a tree, rock, or any natural or artificial object on its surface. At the time, there was not even a domestic animal in the field. In another field, beyond the pasture, a dozen slaves were at work under an overseer. Throwing away the stump of a cigar, the planter rose, saying, "I forgot to tell Andrew about those horses." Andrew was the overseer. Williamson strolled leisurely down the gravel walk, plucking a flower as he went, passed across the road and into the pasture, pausing a moment as he closed the gate leading into it to greet a passing neighbor, Ashmore Wren, who lived on an adjoining plantation. Mr. Wren was in an open carriage with his son James, a lad of 13. When he had driven some 200 yards from the point of meeting, Mr. Wren said to his son, "I forgot to tell Mr. Williamson about those horses." Mr. Wren had sold to Mr. Williamson some horses, which were to have been sent for that day, but for some reason not now remembered, it would be inconvenient to deliver them until the morrow. The coachman was directed to drive back, and as the vehicle turned, Williamson was seen by all three, walking leisurely across the pasture. At that moment, one of the coach horses stumbled and came near falling. It had no more than fairly recovered itself when James Wren cried, "Why, father, what has become of Mr. Williamson?" It is not the purpose of this narrative to answer that question. Mr. Wren's strange account of the matter, given under oath in the course of legal proceedings relating to the Williamson estate, here follows. My son's exclamation caused me to look towards the spot where I had seen the deceased an instant before, but he was not there, nor was he anywhere visible. I cannot say that, at the moment, I was greatly startled or realized the gravity of the occurrence, although I thought it singular. My son, however, was greatly astonished and kept repeating his question in different forms until we arrived at the gate. My coachman, Sam, was similarly affected, even in a greater degree, but I reckon more by my son's manner than by anything he had himself observed. As we got out of the carriage at the gate of the field, and while Sam was tying the team to the fence, Mrs. Williamson, with her child in her arms, and followed by several servants, came running down the walk in great excitement, crying, "He is gone! He is gone! Oh God, what an awful thing!" and many other such exclamations, which I do not distinctly recollect. I got from them the impression that they related to something more than the mere disappearance of her husband, even if that had occurred before her eyes. Her manner was wild, but not more so, I think, than was natural under the circumstances. I have no reason to think she had, at that time, lost her mind. I have never since seen nor heard of Mr. Williamson. This testimony, as might have been expected, was corroborated in almost every particular by the only other eyewitness, if that is the proper term, the lad James. Mrs. Williamson had lost her reason, and the servants were, of course, not competent to testify. The boy James Wren had declared at first that he saw the disappearance, but there is nothing of this in his testimony given in court. None of the field hands working in the field to which Williamson was going had seen him at all, and the most rigorous search of the entire plantation and adjoining country failed to provide a clue. The most monstrous and grotesque fictions were current in that part of the state for many years, and probably are to this day, but what has been here related is all that is certainly known of the matter. The courts decided that Williamson was dead, and his estate was distributed according to law. 2. An unfinished race. James Byrne Warson was a shoemaker who lived in Leamington, Warwickshire, England. He had a little shop in one of the byways leading off the road to Warwick. In his humble sphere, he was esteemed an honest man, although, like many of his class in English towns, he was somewhat addicted to drink. When in liquor, he would make foolish wagers. On one of these too frequent occasions, he was boasting of his prowess as a pedestrian and athlete, and the outcome was a match against nature. For a stake of 1 sovereign, he undertook to run all the way to Coventry and back, a distance of something more than 40 miles. This was on the 3rd day of September in 1873. He set out at once. The man with whom he had made the bet, whose name is not remembered, accompanied by Barham Wise, a linen draper, and Hammerson Burns, a photographer, I think, following in a light cart or wagon. For several miles, Warson went on very well, at an easy gait, without apparent fatigue, for he had really great powers of endurance, and was not sufficiently intoxicated to enfeeble them. The 3 men in the wagon kept a short distance in the rear, giving him occasional friendly chaff or encouragement as the spirit moved them. Suddenly, in the very middle of the road, not a dozen yards from them, and with their eyes full upon him, the man seemed to stumble, pitched headlong forward, uttered a terrible cry, and vanished. He did not fall to the earth. He vanished before touching it. No trace of him was ever discovered. After remaining at or about the spot for some time, with aimless irresolution, the 3 men returned to Leamington, told their astonishing story, and were afterward taken into custody. But they were of good standing, had always been considered truthful, were sober at the time of the occurrence, and nothing ever transpired to discredit their sworn account of their extraordinary adventure, concerning the truth of which, nevertheless, public opinion was divided throughout the United Kingdom. If they had something to conceal, their choice of means is certainly one of the most amazing ever made by sane human beings. So what do you think, dear listeners? What happened to Williamson and to James Byrne Warson, who certainly was sent to Coventry? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and stay safe, stay subscribed, ring the bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes, and share this opus with anyone you please. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and the Black-Eyed Children. So again, please consider subscribing. Till midnight, cheers! Text of the stories read today, courtesy of Project Gutenberg. Pictures used in the video, courtesy of Pix Here, PX Here. The music was Haunted by Screams by the wonderfully talented Mayu.